This is your Midterms, a forum on citizenship, elections, and the test of American democracy. My name is Stacey Rostauskas. I'm the Vice President for Government Affairs here at The Ohio State University. It's my pleasure to give some welcoming remarks and introduce our panelists. On November the 8th, which is 1 week from today, not that anybody up here is counting, 8 million Americans will cast their votes in the first federal election since the unprecedented events following the 2020 election. These midterms will be a major test of American democracy. How prepared are we? If you're eligible, would you vote? We have learned since 2020 that this test extends beyond Election Day. If a race is contested, how should we sort through the relevant information and misinformation to make up our own minds responsibly? How should we accept an outcome even if we don't like it? What options do we have for justified civic action? And tonight we will discuss these and other questions that are crucial to America's future. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, IDEA, as part of the Shop Class for Democracy project, as well as the Office of Academic Affairs Civil Discourse project. So without further ado, I will introduce tonight's panel. Our moderator for the evening is David Staley, who is an associate professor in the Department of History, where he teaches courses in digital history and historical methods, and holds courtesy appointments in the Departments of Design and Educational Studies, where he has led the Forum on the University. He is also the host of one of my favorite podcasts, Voices of Excellence in Arts and Sciences. Aaron Ackerman is the Executive Director of the Ohio Association of Elections Officials. This is a bipartisan organization that represents Ohio's 88 county boards of elections. Aaron has had a background in the public and private sector, both in Washington and here in the state of Ohio at the State House. He's represented nonprofit organizations, statewide associations, colleges, local governments before the legislature, and has run and volunteered on numerous local, state, and legislative statewide campaigns. Sahar Haidari-Fard is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy here at Ohio State. Her work lies in the intersection of social and behavioral sciences, social and political philosophy, and ethics. She examines the possibility of sustainable change in complex social systems and the moral implications of such change. Before Ohio State, she taught at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. And last but not least is Michael Neblo, the College of Arts and Sciences alumni professor of political science, and by courtesy in philosophy, communication, and public affairs at The Ohio State University. He's also the director for the Institute of Democratic Engagement and Accountability, IDEA, which I'm sure we'll hear more about tonight, and his work focuses on deliberation, political psychology, and innovations in representative democracy. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Stacey. And we're going to start with just some opening remarks from the panelists. And at some stage in the evening, we'll be taking questions both from the live audience here, but also from the live stream audience. We'll be monitoring the discussion chat function there. So we want to make certain that everyone is involved this evening. We're going to start off with some opening remarks. We'll start at the far end with Michael, please.
Well, great. Thank you so much, David and Stacey. I'm delighted to be up here with my co-panelists as well. And thanks to all of you who've made the time to come out here in person, and to all of those of you who might be watching the live stream. I have been thinking a lot about, I teach Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. And I've found myself haunted by a particular part of it lately. Where Dr. King said, I'm going to quote it so that I get it right. The context here is that he's in jail for leading protests in Birmingham, and a group of moderate white ministers wrote an open letter to Dr. King saying, why are you protesting? Why are you causing disruptions? Why not just negotiate and engage in regular politics instead of disruptive politics? And Dr. King kind of goes head on, and he says, you may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Too long have we been bogged down in a tragic effort to live in monologue rather than dialogue. And the reason I think that that's so powerful and important is that, as I read it, what Dr. King is saying is that the purpose of extraordinary politics, of protest, disruption, is to get us back to what I study, which is deliberative politics, which is how we talk to each other in a democratic society and get on with our day-to-day lives. And so for me, one of the really crucial questions of citizenship and participation in a democratic community is knowing when to make that transition, and make the transition in both directions. When it's no longer time for deliberative politics. The conditions for that just aren't met, and we've got to be out in the streets. We've got to have boycotts. We've got to have disruptive protest, as the civil rights movement had. And then when do we transition back? Because as Dr. King says, the point is to get back to negotiation, to good faith deliberation, to justifying things to each other. And it seems to me that if we're in a mode of all disruptive politics all the time, and that people use that power afforded to them, at least in the United States, in guarantees in the Constitution, if they use it irresponsibly, if they use it cynically and strategically, rather than when it's really, really necessary, we're going to be in a bad place. And I fear that we might have arrived at, or we're threatening to arrive in that bad place, and that a lot of people are in a constant mode of outrage politics. And actually, I should note, I'm not sure it's always cynical. I think people might really believe it, but then the question becomes whether it's really justified, and maybe it is, I don't know. But that's one of the big questions that I'd like to explore tonight, and I think it's one of the most important questions that democratic citizens have to ask themselves. And then real quickly, there's a second one, and that's more just kind of inside our heads. All of us, I do political psychology, and in general social psychology, there's a phenomenon called motivated reasoning, or specifically partisan motivated reasoning. And the basic gist is letting what we want to be true drive what we believe to be true, what we believe is actually true, right? Irrespective of the evidence, right? And the balance of that. And I think it's a universal tendency, and we have to work hard to fight it. And strategies for fighting that, I think, are going to be crucial for also helping us decide when disruptive politics and deliberative politics are appropriate.
Thank you, Michael. Sahar, please.
Thank you for amazing remarks. What I want to maybe add to what Michael just shared is something like, or some more emphasis on how complicated and difficult it is to figure out or answer those questions, and how much we rely on each other to answer those questions, and how much we are prone to all the objections that we make for others. And it might be very, very hard for us to answer those questions that are very important to answer and can play an important role in what decision we make when we are trying to decide whether we should act directly or not. And how much we have power over that by controlling who we are talking to, and how often or how much we let others' opinion influence ours, and how we can rethink our network of influence, our network of trust, and how we can rely on that network for information that we could not have had otherwise, or we could not have had if we wanted to do all the research ourselves. But at the same time, it is important to know that we should do some work ourselves too, and you cannot just rely on others to help you navigate the social world and figure out what you should do and what you shouldn't. And I'm hoping that I can insert this insight into the conversation with the other panelists.
Thank you. Aaron, please.
Well, it should be noted that I have several less letters next to my name than anyone else on the panel. So what I hope to do tonight is maybe help the audience understand some of the practical implications of these philosophical questions and kind of the practicality of how the election system works. Because if we can't understand that and trust that, then obviously these philosophical questions become very real very quickly. So as someone who represents local boards of elections, I hope to maybe pull back the curtain a little bit on the elections machinery, how elections are run, why I think we should have a high degree of confidence in elections here in the state of Ohio, and the very deliberative and overt and intentional laws that we've set up and rules that we've set up to make sure that our elections are fair and free and accurate and open and transparent. And if we can kind of start from that framework, then I think the conversation takes on a really interesting tone, and I'm really excited to be up here with my fellow panelists to kind of unpack both these academic and philosophical questions as well as the practical underpinnings to some of those questions.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you for those remarks. I wanted to start first with some definitions, as after Michael invited me to moderate the panel. My first impulse is to always go toward definitions, defining terms. You can't have a conversation unless you're all sort of in somewhat of agreement about what it is we're talking about, what it is we're having a conversation about. And I'd like to start, if it's not too philosophical, start with democracy. It's in the title here. It's sort of embedded, I think, in all of our assumptions. I'm curious to sort of to understand, what do we mean by democracy? Or what do you think democracy is? Is it just voting? Is it just casting a ballot? Does that sort of exhaust the definition and meaning of democracy? Do we start with the political scientist?
Sure, I'll jump in on that. So it's a surprisingly complicated question, actually.
Well, it's part of the reason why I asked it.
Yeah. So at one level, we know it when we see it, right? At another level, this is very contested. China, President Xi of China refers to China as a consultative socialist democracy. Americans, I think most Americans, are disinclined to think of China as a democracy in the sense that we mean democracy, right? And of course, democracy, the meaning of democracy has changed over time. A lot of people in the United States, I'm surprised my students are very insistent that the United States is not a democracy.
Is that so?
Yeah, that we're a constitutional republic. And of course, this is true, we're a constitutional republic. And if by democracy you mean a direct democracy, like the Athenian democracy, we're not a democracy in that sense, but really no major country has been for 2.5 millennia. So I think it's actually pretty safe to use the word democracy in referring to the United States. I don't have a big problem with that anyway. But as a political scientist, I'll just mention a really, I think, super cool project. It's called the VDEM project, Varieties of Democracy. It's a big international project. And they've tried to really expand what we understand to contribute to democracy beyond voting, right? So the first principle is electoral, so it is voting. That is at the core of most people's notions of a democracy. But they add in 4 more. One that they call liberal, so that's kind of like the rule of law or a constitutional democracy, individual freedoms, checks and balances, things along those lines. Participatory, so lots of opportunities in civil society outside of formal politics for participation. Localism, so pushing power down where people can actually access it more easily. Federalism in the context of the United States. Deliberation, which is what I study. So reason justification, explaining to each other why we're going to, exercise the rule of law over you, right? If you break the law, people with guns might show up at your door, and it's a basic principle of respect on some people's account that we explain why we're doing that. And if we can't explain it, that's a problem. So it's the deliberative criterion. And then another one is, the 5th one that they talk about, is the egalitarian criterion. So equal protection to the law, equal access to political office, and the ability to speak about politics and have your voice heard. And then some people would even add in access to equal basic resources, education, healthcare. If you're thinking about where your next meal is going to come from, you can't effectively participate as an equal in politics. And so the VDEM project tries to measure all 5 dimensions on multiple criteria for every country going back in time. And it's really quite extraordinary. So there's a lot of criteria, electoral being probably the single most basic one, but I think all 4 of these others count.
Tahar?
So, as the philosopher in the room, I'm gonna give a very vague and general definition. And I would say democracy, in my understanding, is this acknowledgement that governing ourselves and governing a society is a very complex task. And it requires a lot of insights and a lot of information that might be very difficult to have for anyone. But we have rules and norms and practices that help us to make it easier for ourselves and bring in insights from everyone or the most number of people possible. Sometimes it can be manifested through voting, but a lot of other times it's like public dialogue, forums, discussions, collective action, collective thinking, collective projects, community organizing, and many other tools that we use to bring in insights from so many different people, amplify the voice of people who wouldn't have a place or wouldn't have the resources to make their voice heard otherwise, and make sure that we can provide a space that people can constructively disagree with each other, and the stakes are not that high for disagreement. And we can use that disagreement as a source of inspiration to make progress, to achieve things that we couldn't achieve otherwise.
Aaron, anything to add or subtract?
I would probably just be subtracting at this point, but I think to me it just means the right to self-govern, and that society comes together and they say collectively, we're going to govern ourselves. We're not going to be governed by, a king or a ruler or a tyrant or a certain class of people. We are going to collectively figure this out together. And so it involves, I think, all of those things that Michael and Sahar mentioned are kind of key and component to that. But at its core, to me, it just means we're going to figure this out together.
Michael, you said some of your students, maybe you said many of your students,
Yeah.
insist that we are not a democracy. So what are we if we're not a democracy, at least according to your students?
A republic, a constitutional republic, and we are a constitutional republic, right?
Why do they split that hair? I mean, what point are they making in splitting that hair?
That's a great point, because I don't think they think they're splitting hairs, and if you accept the terms of what they say, they're not splitting hairs, right? So usually it comes up in the context of a presumption that majorities should get what they want in a democracy, full stop, right? If that's what you mean by a democracy, then it's not splitting hairs to say that we're not a democracy. There's a big difference between that and a constitutional republic, where there are liberal freedoms that trump majorities sometimes. There's the rule of law. There's so Aaron talked about the practicalities of what he does. My very first sort of academic job was in the aftermath of the 2000 election, the difficulties over the Bush-Gore election, and I was a research assistant to the Federal Commission on, the Commission on Federal Election Reform, and I had to study the nuts and bolts of the federal election system. And I'm here to tell you what Aaron does is every bit as complicated as what Sahar and I do, maybe more. It was mind-blowing, the complexity of election administration, election law, the number of jurisdictions. This is a very complicated business, and so much hinges on it. And so getting that done efficiently, professionally, legally, to my mind is a major public service and something that's really, really important. And essentially we've starved the resources of election administrators. And I'm bringing that up in the context of saying this republic versus democracy sort of thing, right? In that, what election administration does is set the procedural rules. It's not just counting heads, it's how we count heads, right? And it turns out that is not a simple matter. And if we don't get it right, we threaten injustice, we threaten social unrest, we threaten all kinds of other sorts of things, which is why I was so excited to have Aaron on the panel. This is, I think people think, oh, it just happens. No, it doesn't just happen.
We do work more than 2 days a year.
Yeah, thousands of people do very complicated things to make it happen.
And I'm going to want Aaron to talk at some stage here tonight about what some of that complex business or complicated business looks like.
Sure.
Sahar, you had said some of the effect of one of the things we do in a democracy is create a space to constructively disagree, which I think is very interesting. What is this space? Is it an abstract notion, or do we have structures, institutions in place where we constructively disagree?
Well, I felt like voting is like a very safe like starting point, that like people disagree with each other, but you don't have to even confront anyone else. You can just go and cast your vote. But we also have many other institutions like local governments, or like even we practice this at schools and universities, to be able to share our ideas and like be exposed to people who think very differently from us. They have experiences that are very different from us. They have concerns that are different, coexist with them and come up with like practices or norms or cultures or ways that facilitate that kind of cooperation, facilitates cooperation with someone who is very different from you, has a very different upbringing, but at the same time you have the opportunity to pool your resources and insights and do things that you couldn't do otherwise. So I would say like it can, like that kind of like democratic norms or democratic ideals can have manifestation in every aspect of our lives. You can have it even in, I don't know, Thanksgiving dinners if you are successful. But these are like ideals that like represent themselves in many aspects of our lives. These are kind of habits that we pick up on if we want to do it right.
Aaron, tell us about your complicated business. Give us a sense of the depth of the kinds of issues you have to deal with every day.
Sure.
Not just simply on November 8th.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I always liken it, if you've ever planned a wedding or tried to kind of understand the logistics of just ordering, the correct number of chickens for people or steaks or whatever, you know that it's extraordinarily, it's that for a couple hundred people can be very difficult and challenging, right? And getting all the logistics right. Planning elections is kind of similar into that, in that you kind of have this date, and you're either going to have an election on November 8th or you're not. You're either going to be married on your marriage date or you're not. And you have a budget, right? And you have all these tasks that you have to accomplish before November 8th. And they have to go in a certain order, and they have to be done before the next one can be done, and you only have so many resources to do it. And it can be, extremely overwhelming. I got a graph from the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, and this was probably 10 years ago, and I just said, what do you have to do to pull this thing off? And they sent me a list, and it was about 600 different individual tasks for every single election, so 2-3 a year, where they had to do this by this date in order to be able to do the next task by this date. And so it's just, and we can talk, in more detail about what that looks like, but at a very high level, it's extremely complex. We vote for an extended period of time. Here in Ohio, we actually run 3 elections kind of simultaneously. If you think about it, we do a mail election, so we give people the opportunity to vote by mail. That's kind of an election unto itself. We let people come in and vote early, 28 days at the Board of Elections. Every election, that's kind of an election unto itself, to have people come into your office and vote. And then obviously we still have 40 to 50% of the public that votes on Election Day at their polling location, and that is an election as well. So trying to kind of simultaneously do those 3 very complex tasks at once can be challenging. Election administrators are called on to be lawyers, chief financial officers, social media gurus, everything really that you can imagine kind of goes into that job. So there's a lot of complexities involved.
And it works, and works well.
Surprisingly well.
Surprisingly well.
Yeah.
I think sometimes that's been lost in the last few years or so. It works.
Yeah. We don't run perfect elections in Ohio because we're humans. But by and large, we do a really, really good job in getting the big stuff done very, very well. And, of course, you just can't sweat all the little things, just like on your marriage day. If, if grandpa gets chicken instead of steak, we'll get through it, I guess. But we do an extraordinarily good job. We have a really good system in place here in Ohio, and we have extraordinary individuals at the county boards of elections and at the Secretary of State's office that administer elections with a lot of integrity and enthusiasm and success.
Michael, you had said something in your opening remarks that I wanted to draw attention to, and I think Sahar was also sort of talking about this. You had talked about how we talk to each other in a democratic society. So how do we talk to each other? How are we doing? Maybe that's a question I want to ask. How are we doing at talking with each other?
On the whole, less well than we have. I don't think that's exactly a big surprise right now, but that's not destiny. We can make choices to talk more constructively and civilly to each other, but I think we have to tee each other up for success. And part of that is why we have forums like this, why we hear from people like Aaron about the complexities. So yeah, if Grandpa gets chicken instead of beef, you deal with it, right? But if something goes wrong with an election administrator, potentially somebody's fundamental right has been violated. That is a high stakes business, and so not recklessly impugning the work that I don't know what the number is in Ohio. I have it in my head from that job years ago that the state of California has 7,000 different electoral districts, in like they have to prepare 7,000 different ballots and administrative units. Like the fact that things don't go wrong at extraordinary rates is frankly mind-blowing. And so, part of the answer in how we talk to each other, I think, is just slowing down and making sure that if we're going to make a serious accusation, that there are grounds for it. And sometimes there are. Things do go wrong, either by accident or occasionally, although there's quite a bit of evidence on my understanding of things, that it's very occasionally purposely, meaning fraud or various other sorts of malfeasance. But that this is, the fraud and malfeasance part is really quite rare because professional election administrators run a surprisingly tight ship, and that the mistakes generally are in the big picture relatively rare compared to the number of things that have to happen, and typically hopefully aren't systematic. If they are, then we need to address that, and we got to gather the evidence and confront that directly, and sometimes I think they are. There's evidence that they are. But that one of the responsibilities of individual citizenship and leadership in a democracy is not passing up criticism of mistakes when they're real, but also making sure you got your ducks lined up if you're going to make a serious accusation, because it's not just chicken or beef, it's fundamental rights. And these days, it's also the reputations and physical safety of the people who are doing this difficult job. And that part, I hope my admiration for people like Aaron is evident in the fact that they're now, their reputations and physical safety are under attack. Makes me crazy.
And I do, later on, I do want to ask Aaron a little bit more about what the situation in Ohio looks like there. Sahar, how would you describe, I guess, the quality of our national conversation? I hear that term all the time, our national conversation, and it just seems too abstract for me. Where is this conversation occurring, and what are we saying to each other? Is that what social media is for? Our democracy is dependent upon social media, on Twitter, on Instagram?
Well, yes and no. Yes, because we see some meaningful change in the way that people find others who agree with them, even if they had maybe perhaps before they had a harder time finding others who would like share the same opinion, but it's much easier now to find like a community of people or a group of people who agree with you on anything. Like for whatever crazy idea comes to your mind, you can Google it and find a bunch of other people who are the same. And we're all prone to this kind of maybe confirmation bias that if we are surrounded by people who agree with us, it is less likely for us to double check or to doubt whether the source of our beliefs are actually legitimate or we have good reasons to believe in those things or not. So I think social media has changed the way that we interact with each other or we seek beliefs. But at the same time, it is important to know that, like, well, when you have a lot of connection or a lot of access to others and you can be influenced by so many people all at once, things that people believe in are gonna get more chaotic and you're gonna see more disagreement between people, and you're gonna feel a lot more uncomfortable than it would otherwise. So I felt like to some extent it might be something that we should even celebrate, that people are disagreeing with each other, or like they share their ideas, or they're like engaged enough that they are willing to risk some social ties with each other to support the claim that they have. But at the same time, it is also true that like we are prone to jumping on bandwagons that we shouldn't, and we might not see at that moment what are the actual costs of this wagon that we're jumping onto. And sometimes the cost is very high. And I felt like for those moments, maybe all of us have this kind of like ethical or epistemic obligation to like slow down, to think twice, and make sure that this bandwagon that we're jumping onto not gonna get us somewhere that would be very difficult to get out of. So going back to your first question, is like, well, like there are a lot of good things that comes out of the new age of interaction, and like the disagreements, some of them are, I think, are sources of more creative ideas, change in ways that we should appreciate. But there are also very serious dangers that we should be aware of, and maybe come up with new norms that help us to distinguish good and bad kind of like social influence, and maybe rethink the norms that we have. Because I don't think that just being calm and collected and respectful is not all that at this point in time in history we can say about cooperative discussions. Sometimes calm and collective is not available to people, not because they're not engaging in good faith, but because their situation is like very difficult, or the cost of translating their concerns to what other people would accept as legitimate is very high. And maybe we should reach out and engage with those people even more and help them share their concerns. But there's some other times that the concerns are not legitimate, and we have reasons to doubt them seriously. So I think we need to have a lot more discussions to update our norms to help us figure out how to navigate this new situation.
Does that include more people voting? I don't know what the numbers are. I see them sort of every year or so. Aaron, you must have these at your fingertips, right?
I probably should. Yeah, we've seen an uptick. I mean, obviously, 2020 in a pandemic, in Ohio at least, we set a record as far as number of registered voters, number of people that turned out to vote. It was incredible that under those kinds of conditions, people were that enthusiastic and engaged that they did want to turn out and express their opinion about how they wanted to be governed.
There's so much talk today, and I want to get everyone's sort of initial reaction to this. We hear so much that our democracy is under threat. Is that true? Let's start with that. Is that a true statement? Our democracy is under threat. Michael, want to tackle that?
Yeah, our democracy is under threat.
Our democracy.
Yeah. Our democracy is under threat. I think the health. So Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French aristocrat, philosopher, sociologist, it's not exactly clear how to describe him, right? Really talked about not just the formal institutions of government, but the informal aspects of society that underwrite our ability to make those institutions work, right? You can have the most sophisticated jet fighter in the world, but if you don't know how to fly it, you're going to crash, right? I think that the preconditions for democracy that Tocqueville talked about are in the worst shape that we've seen since the lead up to the Civil War. At least broadly understood. The civil rights era around race was much worse. And I don't want to demote that. But what I think what we're facing now is pervasive. It's pretty much everything. And that worries me. Are we under threat? Did you say threat? Or is threatened? It worries me.
Aaron?
Yeah, the biggest concern I have at this point is that elected officials get away from accepting election results. I read an article today, I can't remember where it was, that said that there are a handful of candidates who have basically told their supporters, if I lose, it's because there was cheating, unequivocally. If I lose, it's not because I didn't sell my ideas or the voters didn't choose me, it's because somehow I was robbed and cheated. If that becomes the norm, then we are in really, really big trouble, because then I don't know how as citizens we respond to those kinds of statements pervasively and repeatedly. We have to get back to a place where people, win or lose, they accept the results and they move on, or else I agree with Michael, I'm concerned about that.
Sahar?
Well, I'm thinking that perhaps I'm not the best person to answer that question, because philosophers don't say useful things ever. But I'm thinking that there are some epistemic authorities in the society that we kind of rely on to make it easier for us to figure things out. We have doctors or universities to figure important questions that we don't have expertise to figure out on our own. And we kind of need those epistemic authorities to be able to live our lives without worrying about all these problems ourselves. And I think the election system in general is one of those pillars or epistemic authorities that we rely on. And when the trust in those authorities is not there, or people are doubting it, we might feel legitimately that our democracy is under threat, or the society that we're living in is in crisis. And I think these are very important feelings to have and be aware of, and make sure that that's not the case. But at the same time, I'm thinking that it is important to think that we should not categorically dismiss worries. We should engage with them, and we have done that. We have engaged with those worries, and we have shown that these worries are not legitimate, and there's no good reason to believe that there's any election fraud, so on and so forth. But maybe we should try to engage more, or try to reach out more to not create silos of people who latch onto these doubts and create discussions that are not helpful, or threaten the authority of these systems that we have in place in a way that it's very unhelpful.
On the heels of the attack on Paul Pelosi, the Axios has reported that the FBI has issued a warning about threats to election workers ahead of the midterm elections. Is this an issue in Ohio?
We've been pretty lucky in Ohio. For the past 2 years or so, I really didn't hear about people being threatened, harassed, maybe told that they're terrible at their jobs and they don't know what they're doing. You know, people calling boards and kind of saying those kinds of things, but not really physically threatening them. Only recently has that started to occur in Ohio, and that's obviously very disturbing. And in light of the recent attack and some of the things going on around the country, I think it's pause for my folks to be very, very concerned.
What can you or what can any election official do, if anything?
Well, you hope that you don't have to resort to having a police escort or whatever, or some kind of personal safety. But I know that election officials in other states, it's come to that point where they have had to be escorted from their office to their car by police or security guards. So you hope it doesn't get to that point. But you have to take it seriously. We have all kinds of agreements in place with the authorities for Election Day to make sure that people are safe and secure. Typically, we have some kind of presence at early voting centers to make sure our voters understand that they're going to be safe when they step into that place. So the concern obviously extends not just to election workers, but to our poll workers and to our voters as well. And we don't want to have to be in that position.
What are the effects on democracy, you think, this particular issue?
I'll cite the case in Arizona where you had the armed individuals sitting across from a ballot drop box with masks on, and writing down people's license plates and things like that. That's not productive. I can't condone that. I don't think anyone should condone that as thinking that's a good or acceptable way to engage in our democratic process. And so, again, I understand that the Justice Department is looking into that particular situation, and hopefully authorities take steps to make sure that that isn't repeated and doesn't spread. You
had said in your opening remarks that, and we've talked about it here already this evening, that we should have confidence in our elections, in our electoral system. Why don't we have confidence?
I think it gets back to, well, maybe I'll share a story. I was on a Zoom call with the state elections director from the state of Georgia, the much maligned state of Georgia, right? And this was right after the 2020 election, and he said that one of his, I think, college friends who knew who he was and what he did called him shortly after the election and said, I just can't believe that all this fraud is going on, and geez, I know you're in a position to understand these things. Can you help me, walk me through why I should trust in the election system here in Georgia? And the elections director said he took 2 hours and he walked through. Here's exactly what happened. Here's why what you're reading on the internet is not true. In fact, here's the truth. And he spent 2 hours with this gentleman. And at the end of the 2 hours, the guy said, man, this is great. Thank you so much for sharing this information. I just still think the election was stolen. I don't know what we can do societally to move people beyond a point where they just are not willing to be confronted with facts and have the ability to change their opinions, based on pretty hard evidence. And that again is another reason why I agree with Michael that there is room to be concerned here when that kind of situation is repeating itself.
What can be done, Michael?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons a direct idea, and we wanted to sponsor a forum like this, is that I think that there are things that individuals can do, and I think that there are things we can do institutionally as well, but I'll focus on the individuals because this forum was intended primarily for our undergraduates, or students generally, but especially our undergraduates who are in some cases voting for the first time. Certainly haven't been doing it long or often yet, right? And thinking about how to get into good habits on that. I think one of them is to make a point ahead of time. One of the reasons I wanted to have a lot of election forums are after the election, right? I wanted this one to be before the election because a lot of work in social psychology says if you think through the principles you're going to use to make a decision ahead of time before you know how things are going to turn out, right? It's a lot harder to fool yourself on the back end and tell yourself a story about, why this one was fraudulent and I need to be in the streets, right? And sometimes we have to. That's important to say. Occasionally things go wrong. And if an election is unfair, it needs to be contested, right? But I think people committing to thinking it through ahead of time, I think people making connections in their personal networks with people that they know from experience are not stupid, are not morally vicious, are not trying to overthrow the government or to get fraudulent candidates into power through deception, right? And make sure that we hear from them too, right? And maybe even ask them. This is a thing I've thought about for a long time. I always subscribe, it's not paper anymore, but for years I've subscribed to a journal that articulates a political position that's different from mine. And I always have one that I subscribe to along those lines. And the way I found it was talking to friends who don't think like me. And I said, what's the best stuff out there? What should I be reading, right? And so I'm not saying everybody has to subscribe to something, but not letting yourself sit comfortably and not hear the other side, which isn't to say that you listen to everything. Some of it is junk, right? But just having a little bit of faith, democratic faith, if you will, that there are at least some people of goodwill on the other side and that you need to hear from them. And I think that that's the single biggest thing we can do to slow us down and make sure that if we do go into the streets, we're doing it on the right issue for the right reasons, and not to get manipulated into doing it by people who have a direct interest in manipulating us, in getting us to do it for bad reasons. I'll stop there. I have others, but that's the single biggest thing I think people can do themselves. Every single citizen can do that.
Sahar, how would you add to this sort of confidence in our electoral system? How do we bolster that or ensure that?
I think something that came to my mind while Michael was sharing his point of view was that a lot of people don't go to the street when they're protesting something because they believe in something or not. A lot of people go to the street because their friends do, because people who they trust do. Sometimes because that's the cool thing to do, or sometimes it's because everyone who they respect or they affiliate themselves with do. And I felt like that just highlights the importance of thinking about your social connections and thinking about the fact that sometimes you can be trapped in a group of people who you trust, and they also trust you, but that also reduces your sensitivity or your the time that you spend on thinking about whether this issue that you're believing in is right or not. And sometimes you don't have to go that far away. In your already existing network of friends, family, and relatives, and coworkers, there are others who are different from you enough that when you reach out to them, you can see things from a slightly different point of view. And I think we all have an obligation to do that. We don't have to believe in what they're saying, you don't have to agree with them, but you do have to engage with them to see things from a different perspective, because you cannot be true, right about everything. It's just not plausible to think that that's the case. And if you want to get to the truth, I'm not saying that we can even get to truth of everything all the time, but to make sure that you've done what you needed to do to get to the best possible answer, you need to reach out to people who are different from you. And doing so, if we all do that, or if not enough of us do that, we can kind of fix the holes in our social networks that like traps some of us in some silos that doesn't let us hear others, or protect us from the claims that other people legitimately might have against us. And it can solve a lot of different problems, including trust in electoral politics.
I would just add also, I hope, by sounding maybe a little too defensive here, boards of elections are happy to have questions asked and to engage their voters. So I would encourage people, if you have questions, pick up the phone and call your board of elections. They will take the time, to walk you through your concerns. They will pull back the curtain. They'll probably invite you to come be a poll worker and participate directly in that process, and you can actually go in. That's the beautiful thing about our system is if you don't trust it, you can get on the inside and see how it works firsthand and kind of discover some of those safeguards that we've put in place. So I do hope that people out there, if you have questions, you pick up the phone and you call your board and ask them.
I know you can't give a blanket answer for all of Ohio. Has it been problematic this election to get poll workers? For the first time, so I voted early last week, as I was walking out, someone asked me, would you like to be a poll worker? I have never been asked that before in all the years that I've been voting.
Yeah,
Should I take that as a sign of something?
I will give a blanket answer. We always need poll workers.
Oh, okay, all right.
Always need poll workers. We always encourage folks to get involved that way. And we always need good people to do that.
But it's not a particular issue, one way or the other this time.
It's a perennial issue for boards of elections.
In a minute here, I want to take questions. I don't know if these mics are live or if there's a way that we can move the mic around. And we'll also ask here in a moment if there are live stream questions. I wanted to, as I know we're talking about sort of before November 8th, I want to take you now to November 9th and just ask each of you, what are the possibilities? What do you think, not what you hope, what do you think November 9th is going to look like this year, the day after the election? Michael? Not what you hope, but what your professional judgment, what you think it's going to look like.
I'm pretty concerned. I think because I could see sizable groups of people from either side mobilizing, meaning whichever way it turns out, there's a group of people that are going to be awfully frustrated and angry, and they're allowed to be frustrated, and they're even allowed to be angry. And if there's evidence that things have gone wrong, then fine, in terms of protest. But Aaron referred to how there's candidates out there that it's circular. If I lose, it's because there was fraud, right? John Adams, our second president, isn't often given a lot of credit. In some ways, he wasn't a great president, but he did one enormously important thing, which is he hated Jefferson. Yeah. And it was moderately close, and he had control of the military. He could have stayed in power if he had wanted to. And he valued the peaceful transfer of power. He valued democratic norms, respecting democratic norms, more than he valued being president, more than he valued keeping an enemy away from the reins of power and being able to implement policy that he vehemently disagreed with. And the candidates that Aaron's talking about are showing that they're not, and we've been so fortunate in this country to have an extraordinary line of people respect that precedent. And that norm is eroding. And I find that very, very concerning. And that's why I worry that November 9th, there's real possibilities of violence and unrest that aren't sufficiently linked to people like Aaron messing up their jobs, because they don't very often. And there are just large numbers of people teeing it up to happen. And that hasn't happened on a large scale in the United States to my knowledge, like in a very long time.
Aaron, November 9th?
I will only speak to Ohio, and I'm actually really optimistic about Ohio because I know that my folks are very well prepared and have worked very hard, and I think we're going to have a great election. We've already had 21 days of early voting that's gone largely extraordinarily well. The other little thing I would add, my good friend who has since passed, Peg Rosenfield, I don't know if you ever worked with Peg from the League of Women Voters, she had a great saying. She said, the prayer that every election official says before they go to bed on election night is, "Dear God, please don't let it be close." And I have a
Hanging
feeling,
chads, right?
yeah, and I have a feeling that, maybe with the exception of the U.S. Senate race, it's not going to be a lot of close elections here in Ohio, and that I think in and of itself will help promote some level of confidence in the elections because there's not going to be a lot to argue over.
Do you share Michael's concerns sort of nationwide outside of Ohio?
I do, yes.
Sahar?
Well, I don't know. That's the true and quick answer. But what I do know is that well-connected society has less extremist views in it and extremist actions. And I felt like any other occasion that we face some crisis, we reach out to each other and hold tight to each other to pass the hard time. I think this kind of political situation can be an instance of that too, that we can and we should reach out to each other and hold tight and make sure that people who might be maybe more prone to going to the street for reasons that we might not agree with are connected to us in a way that we can be a weight, not just to force our views on them, but to share that this view that you have, I might not have. It might turn out that you change your view, I don't know, but more connections I felt like here would be helpful for us to make sure that we do things that if we engage in direct action, it brings in concerns from as many people as possible in our surrounding.
One maybe final thought. I really hope that we don't see bad things happen on November 9th, because I think it's important to remember that the election really isn't over on November 8th. We'll have unofficial results, and we'll know more than we knew that morning, but we won't have conclusive results for a little while after that, and that's okay because we're going to take the time to make sure we got it right and to double check our math and to look for issues and problems and audit our elections and do things like that to help make sure that the people do understand that we did a good job. And as Michael's mentioned, to the extent that there are problems, there are legal solutions in place around that, and that is a far preferable way to go about expressing your concerns about how an election might have been administered or conducted than engaging in violent behavior or taking to the streets on November 9th. I think we should all take a deep breath on November 9th and just see what happens and then allow the election to conclude and play out. And if there are areas where there are concerns, let's investigate them and look into them before people do rash things. I really, that's more of a hope, maybe an aspiration. I know you asked for a prediction, but
okay.
I hope that people would think about that in the context of the results on November 8th.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Let's start with a live stream. And thank you, those who are watching on live stream.
Yes, and you can continue to submit any questions you'd like passed on to the panelists. So our first one comes from a listener, viewer named Amira, who asked Dr. Neblo and Dr. Fard, would you say that political polarization hinders the deliberation process in a democratic society?
My favorite answer is yes and no. So polarization leads to a situation that you have some diversity in answers because at least you have two sides, but you have a strong pressure for conformity within the sides. So if you have ideas that are more nuanced, it might sound like a threat for people who are in your team. So you're either with the team, or the minute that you show any difference or divergence, you might be seen as someone who is opposing. So that is an anti-diversity, like heterogeneity in political groups, and that is a bad thing. Because it doesn't allow us to explore different ideas, explore different possibilities, and it makes things more simple and obviously far further away from truth. But at the same time, having two poles is better than having one. So in that regard, I would say it's better than the worst case scenario, but it's still not a good thing, I would say.
So I would start by distinguishing between two kinds of polarization. There's issue polarization, where the substantive policy proposals are far apart from each other and people line up in support for one and the other, and there's not a lot in the middle, right? That, it doesn't strike me, is necessarily a bad thing. The middle is not always the right place to be, right? And sometimes it's the worst of both worlds. Sometimes your preference should be on one end, swing all the way to the other, and something muddled, it could be your least preferred, right? So issue polarization in and of itself, I don't think is a problem in a democracy, though sometimes it might not be very constructive. It does make dialogue difficult in some cases, but it also sharpens what's at stake. So I actually think issue polarization sometimes can help deliberation. And help us really understand what the principles are, what the costs and benefits are, what, and what the open questions are. What political scientists call affective polarization, which is yay for my team and you're bad. You're a bad person because you're on the other team. I don't want my son or daughter, this is a real question, real polling question. Would you have a problem with your son or daughter dating or marrying somebody from the other party? That's affective polarization. Does that hinder political dialogue, political deliberation? Yes, it hinders it powerfully. However, I hope it's okay. I have a paper that I published a couple of years ago, not only like 1 or 2 years ago, that I really like. It's called The Incidental Pundit. And it's based on, I'm a faculty advisor to a student organization here on campus that I really care about a lot. It's undergraduates, and they come from all over, mostly Ohio, but not just Ohio, but all over Ohio. And we got kids from Appalachia, we got kids from inner city Cleveland, brings kids from all over the place together. And they mix, and their friendships aren't primarily based on politics. They're based on things that you base your friends on when you live with them. They live together. And they're part of this organization. They have a common mission. And what we show in the paper is that political influence and learning happens best when you're interacting with people in your social network that you didn't become friends with over politics, right? You're friends with them because they're your roommate. You learn about politics from your roommate because you trust and know that this person is very decent. They pick up after themselves. They do their dishes. They're fun to go out with, right? They're obviously not stupid or morally corrupt just because they happen to disagree with me. And so it creates this posture of openness. And that's where we learn. And that's where we can have constructive dialogue across difference a lot of the times. And so that's why I say ahead of time, cultivating those relationships and affirmatively seeking out people in your social network that you might disagree with politically, but for other reasons, are the sorts of people that you want to hear from. And I think that's the way to defeat affective polarization's chilling effect on deliberation. It took me a while to get back to the questioner's question, but that's why I brought up that anecdote.
Thank you. Do we have questions here? And can we bring a microphone to people? Are you going to walk up to the microphone? That's fine. Terrific. Thank you.
In today's election climate of misinformation, claims of fraud, attempted coups, and ramped up intimidation of poll workers, voting right rollbacks, and even attempted kidnap of election officials, how do you guys expect the role and duties of Secretary of State to evolve?
Wow, what a great question. I would say, and I have to be careful because our Secretary of State's on the ballot, so I don't want to endorse or anything to be construed as good or bad. But he recently, our current Secretary of State recently set up a public integrity division in his office, and that's going to be used to hopefully investigate both claims of fraud, claims of suppression, potential threats against election officials. So it's kind of this new division within the Secretary of State's office that's specifically kind of in response to kind of the climate that we're seeing, I would say. But generally, I hope that whoever our next Secretary of State is a cheerleader for our system of how we elect people here in Ohio, and is kind of uses their bully pulpit to talk about the good things that we do and why people should be confident in our system. And to the extent that mistakes are made or issues happen, to be able to also kind of publicly talk about why that occurred and explain to people rationally why it is a problem or isn't a problem or what we're doing to fix it. The Secretary of State in Ohio, at least for the past 20 years or so, really has had this forward pivot to be able to, I think, impact the attitude of people, the attitude of the system, and the voting system. And so I hope our next Secretary of State does that and uses that forward pivot effectively.
Very good. Other questions? Please.
Thank you for all the work that you all do. I have two questions, one specifically for you, Aaron, but the more general question, as a former social studies teacher teaching American history, my students kind of got tripped up when we talked about the foundation of the country, how much the Constitution means to the country, and then when we get to the Civil War, how people ignored the Constitution, and they make parallels in today's world. What is the best way to teach them and connect the two without necessarily scaring them, because Civil War was the result and a lot of presidential historians and such are worried and share the same sentiments. So how do you make that connection and not make it a political conversation, but it's really an American conversation of our behavior? And then secondly, what is the most basic way to convey the purpose and power of democracy and voting to the most underserved communities, especially in Ohio? I come from an underserved community and impoverished area where voting doesn't matter, and it's the understanding that they don't really get, like, it's the most powerful tool that we have as Americans. So, two-part question.
Answer in any order you'd like.
I'll let the professors answer the question about teaching.
I love that question because I've both of them really, because I've articulated this belief that we're in the worst situation we've been in terms of the preconditions for formal institutions of democracy, the informal preconditions since the Civil War, and that's scary to think about. And I immediately follow up and say, I don't think we're really even all that close to the way we were in the antebellum era, but also that it's kind of cold comfort to come in second place to the Civil War. That's still pretty bad. So I don't know if that's threading the needle between sounding the bell without being overly alarmist. But I guess, as with so many things, I would go back to President Lincoln, right? Who connected the aftermath of the war to the founding and called it the second founding, right? Where we confronted some of the horrible elements of the founding, the things that the founders got wrong in a big way. And that they built up and built into a moment of reckoning, and having to confront that honestly and try to do better. And so I guess and I do, my own students, they're not high school students, but with my own students, I do try to make those connections and just say that it doesn't have to come to war. We're not that close to that yet. But what we do have to do is honestly confront the things that are still not right in our society, our political institutions, and the injustices that remain, and to do so honestly and forthrightly. And that doesn't, and I agree with you, that can, for me, the word political doesn't necessarily have to be a term of abuse. I think it can be political without being partisan or ideological, right? It is political. It's a question of the quality of our politics, our political institutions, and our political culture. But the only people that can fix that are us. And that, that can be really hard because you have to keep faith with people that you intensely disagree with, you might even think are complicit in moral evil, right? But to go back to my opening remarks, the people in the civil rights movement managed to do that. It's extraordinary moral courage to be able to do that, but it's no more than they had to muster, and they did it. And we can do it too.
Zahara, anything you'd like to add?
I would like to pass.
That's fine. Yes. No, it is a good question. And then the second question was, you were going to attack the second question? Or?
Sure, I'm happy to help, and I think it was largely around how do we engage and encourage people in disadvantaged communities to participate in our system. I think it starts, with local election administrators being willing to engage in diversity themselves. Our director here in Franklin County is an African-American gentleman. I think having more people kind of come from that background and have that racial and ethnic diversity is important so that everyone in our communities can understand that they have a voice and they see people that look like them when they engage in the voting process. I also think just emphasizing that every vote really does count. The Secretary of State released numbers recently that of all the elections in the past 3 or 4 years that have been decided by one vote or that have tied and they've gone to a coin flip. So if you're in one of those traditionally disadvantaged communities, man, you have some significant power through the ballot box to affect change in your community. And a lot of those issues that are closer are local issues that really directly impact people. And the other thing I would say is when folks do engage in the process, specifically if they go in and they vote in person on election day, they're going to go to their neighborhood polling place and they are going to see poll workers that are from their own community. And so they'll get a chance to see that the people that are administering these elections that have this high altitude of responsibility on election day and making sure that in the sanctity of your vote are my neighbors, the people I go to church with, the people that I see, I would like to say on football games on Friday night, but usually at 8 p.m. on a Friday night in the fall, election officials are still working. But so maybe the basketball games or whatever. But these are members of your community that care deeply about that community to the point that they want to engage civically and take on this responsibility of administering elections. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but those are maybe a couple starting points.
Should Election Day be a federal holiday, or has that been mooted by early voting and vote by mail?
I don't really have strong opinions one way or another about making it a federal holiday. I know in Ohio we do a great job, I think, of engaging people, and turnout's been up, so that's a positive development.
Other questions, including the live stream? As part of the introduction to this panel, we used the term was evoked of justified civic action. What makes a civic action justified? And I'm thinking of this in the context of November 9th and November 10th, and I know we started imagining some scenarios. What makes a civic action justified? You want to try that, Shahar?
In my understanding, going back to what democracy is, one of the virtues or ideals that the democracy requires or demands from us is this idea of toleration or expanding the circle of our care or concern for people who are around us, to as many people as possible, or to everyone. And I think a civic engagement that moves to achieve that ideal can be distinguished from a civic engagement that moves in the opposite direction. Because if we all agree that there are some important virtues that in democracy, and it be accepted as an ideal. Well, whatever we do that separates us or makes it harder for us to achieve that ideal, well, that's not the right direction to go. But if our engagement is in service of achieving this ideal, that has a different status, I would say.
At the risk of like being a one-trick pony here, I want to go back to Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. I've really like become convinced it's up there with like the Gettysburg Address, and like it's so important to our political culture. And Dr. King says in any nonviolent campaign there are 4 basic steps. And when he says nonviolent campaign, he's saying here justified civil action, right? There are 4 basic steps. Collection of facts to determine whether injustice exists. The first thing we got to do is make sure that we're not going off half-cocked. That that there's, in philosophical terms, epistemic justification here. That and we have to be honest about it, right? Not just somebody told us or it seems my gut tells me, right? No, is there evidence? And he's talking about collecting facts. This is an organized effort. Negotiation. We don't immediately go to some sort of extra political or extrajudicial, out of normal politics. We give people a chance to fix it. You know, talk to your election official. Hear their side of things and their explanation and see what they're going to do about it before you start, you know, throwing Molotov cocktails or something like that, right? The third one is the really interesting one, self-purification. And this comes from Gandhi, and what he means here, I think, is this overcoming motivated reasoning and making sure that you're prepared not to lash back. It's really hard. My dad made me learn to box. When you get punched in the face, it's really hard not to punch back. And the self-purification process is about really prepping for when you get punched in the face, because there's an awfully good chance you are going to get punched in the face. And he was insistent that we not punch back, right? And really getting that control before you then take your justified action. Now, that's, in my view, that's really justified civic action. Not everybody needs to hold themselves necessarily to that standard, but I think that's the ideal. That's the best example we have in American political history of doing it the right way. Mm-hmm. And that we should at least try to move in that direction before we take extraordinary, we make extraordinary civic actions.
I'm not going to be able to add to what Dr. King said about the matter.
Yeah.
Yes, how do you talk?
I don't claim to either, right? I'm just channeling him here, right?
Well, we began with some opening remarks. I wonder if you have closing remarks.
Are we going to reverse order? Or?
Sure.
Okay.
Aaron, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, again, I kind of said at the outset that I hope to instill some confidence on the process. And I'll just mention a couple things that didn't come up over the course of the conversation. Number one, we have a 100% bipartisan way of administering elections here in the state of Ohio, and that is not something that is copied in every state or replicated in every state. Some states have, partisanly elected people that administer elections. That's fine. There are certainly advantages to that. The way we choose to do it in Ohio is to have an appointed bipartisan board of 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and everything we do at the Board of Elections is 100% bipartisan down to how we staff them. So I think that's important to remember, because in order to have and affect fraud or corruption, that means that one party is somehow going to be complicit with the other party. And I don't know any local, Republican and or Democrat who's going to give an inch to the other political party if they don't have to. So I think that's important to remember. And we do find a way, despite that, or maybe because of that, to work together across party lines to administer good elections every single day. And I think that should inspire confidence as well. And we also, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier in my response, we have a very decentralized way of running elections in Ohio. So it is your friends, it is your neighbors that are here, administering your elections. They live in your communities. They care deeply about the communities. They have reputations to uphold when they walk down the street and they want to do a good job, because it's the people that they see every day that they're ensuring that their way of life continues and that their vote counts. And it also, in being decentralized, it makes it very hard to steal an election, because you can't steal one election in Ohio. You have to steal 88 county elections in order to pull that off. And I think that's a strength of our system. So I just wanted to kind of close by saying, again, I know this has been somewhat pessimistic, but I'm also at the same time maybe very optimistic, because I think in Ohio we largely get it very right, and I think we largely do a really good job, and I think people really should have a lot of confidence in the way we conduct elections here.
Thank you. Sahar?
I want to close by saying that we are all social creatures, and being social is very difficult. And even when you do your best to purify yourself, do everything right, you're gonna get it wrong, and you're gonna be influenced by others, or you're gonna be judged by what others who are surrounding yourself with gonna do. You might do everything you want to participate in a nonviolent, perfect collective action, but it's a difficult thing to manage a big population. Someone gonna do something stupid always. And I think we should have something that another philosopher that I really admire calls ideological mercy. They talk about this idea that they came up with, they grew up in a very different kind of ideological environment, and it was so difficult for them to realize that a lot of things that they believed in were just wrong, or were harming them directly, and it was a very, very difficult task to come to realization with that. And their suggestion is we should allow each other to be good people, even though we have even ideologically corrupt ideals, and give each other the space to make mistakes, but make it as harmless as possible, and not take that always as a reason to cut others. But at the same time, we should be compassionate towards ourselves too. Our resources are limited. Our mental health or emotional stability is also a fragile thing. So it's also important to think that I have some limit on how much I can extend myself and understand others or expose myself to others who have very different ideals. But I think this is a very nuanced task, and it's difficult, but both sides are, I think, very important.
Thank you. Michael?
That was great. I'm going to dump what I was going to say in my closing remarks and see if I can, I hope I can do this on the fly, connect two things, something that Aaron said, something that Sahar just said. So Aaron correctly, in my view, said, look, you don't know any politicians, partisan politicians, who are going to give an inch, right? They're going to fight, right? And that's okay. That's their job. They're professionals. It's not necessarily our job as individual citizens. And that's where I think a certain amount of ideological mercy or charity can come in. Give an inch, not a mile, right? That's being okay on ourselves too.
Yeah.
But give an inch. The professionals can take hard lines, but if we line up behind them, taking absolute hard lines down to a person, I think things go badly. The job of the professional politicians and the job of the citizens, even the ones that admire a given group of professional politicians, is different, and we should give an inch once in a while.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us, and those on the live stream, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our very impressive panel. Thank you all.
Thank you.